prostata sa gnoma velénva ilemate. Va susretanu zarásala bíli druga velala lume. Na unkve, lonava unkve obrazanu na výša Etherica Sylvaeron.
In a place where epic expanses intertwine with scientific imagination, we'll encounter races from other planets, both good and evil, and peer into the higher etheric energies that permeate our material universe. In the silence of the protected astral projection, where the boundaries between thought and reality dissolved into radiant whiteness, Alexander began a transmission that would force the Sylvaerons to redefine the very meaning of existence. The space around them became fluid, projecting fragments of Alexander's earliest memories directly into their essences. I chose where I would be born, Alexander began, his voice in their consciousness bearing the tone of one who stood at the source of all rivers. I was not cast into this world by chance. I chose my parents. I chose a lineage that would allow me to be human enough that the network wouldn't recognize me, yet me enough to bring the mission to its end. From the moment of my first breath until my 3rd year, my memory was complete. I carried within me images of the 0 dimension. I knew the precise geometry of the higher etheric energies and the scent of absolute harmony from whence I came. I was a child who carried the weight of entire universes in his eyes. The Sylvaerons saw the image of a small child sitting on a wooden floor, observing his parents with a wisdom that did not belong to that age. When I turned 3, he continued, I told my mother and father quite calmly, I really wanted to be born with you. I remember that childhood sincerity, the desire to thank them for opening the door into matter for me. My mother told me decades later, when I was a 10-year-old boy, how she and my father laughed sweetly then. To them, it was just a moment of childhood imagination, a cute anecdote parents keep as a dear memory. They did not know it was the last flicker of my conscious self. Shortly after that 3rd year, oblivion fell. The material body vehicle demanded all the resources of my consciousness for growth and adaptation. The memory of my origin vanished, suppressed into the deepest layers of the subconscious. But the silence lasted only a decade. In his 13th year, the informatics code of his spark, timed before birth itself, reactivated. I was in the bathroom, Alexander transmitted, and the crew could feel the scent of soap, the coldness of the water on his face, and the moisture felt in the air. After washing, I raised my head and looked at myself in the mirror. It was not the ordinary gaze of a boy on the threshold of puberty. At that moment, a breakthrough occurred. I looked through my eyes, through the pupils, and suddenly the focus shifted. I was no longer looking at the reflection of flesh and bone. I saw the real me. I saw the power that stands behind this material body, the vehicle. From that moment, I could never adapt again. The material world became surreal to me. I was aware I was here, but I knew this was not my home. Alexander's maladjustment to the world of the stone dwellers grew deeper as he began to see what no one else saw. Every step among humans was a test of endurance. I saw beautiful and ugly things hidden deep within human auras, Alexander described, and the Sylvaerons saw faces in his memory that would look ordinary in matter, but in information they screamed with dissonances. Since I went to church with my parents every Sunday, those hours became physical torture for me. Every time I stepped into that building, I would begin to sweat profusely from an indescribable discomfort. The head priest was not what he presented himself to be to the faithful. He hid behind priestly robes and holy words, but I clearly saw that his only desire was material possession. He craved money, power, luxury that none of the people who came to him for comfort could ever afford. His spark was dark, wrapped in his own greed. In places where there were more people, I would see distorted and evil sparks feeding on each other's low frequencies. I ran from such places. Over time, I mastered those situations. I learned to ignore them in order to survive, but deep in my soul, I felt sorry for them. They were tormented, trapped in the desire for things that could never bring them happiness until the end of their small material lives. That surreal feeling of being in a body, in a world that does not recognize its own essence, stayed with me forever. In the astral space, the images of Alexander's childhood shifted, becoming darker and colder, but imbued with an unfathomable power. As a human, I have no consciously controlled abilities. Alexander transmitted while directing the Sylvaerons' consciousness toward an image of an old farmhouse, but in specific, dangerous or borderline situations, I, as a spark, did things that defy all material physics. I first felt it in my 8th year during summer break at my grandparents' house in the village. Everyone was there now, sensing the smell of dry hay, hearing the crickets in the night, and seeing the interior of the small, humble house. It was 3 a.m. I woke up in the middle of the night. Alexander said. From my bed, I could see the other room. In the moonlight entering through the window, I saw the silhouette of a creature standing by the dining table next to the bed where my grandparents slept. One hand was resting on a chair, the other on the table. It was a huge, dark figure radiating a strange, heavy energy. At that moment, the creature's silhouette slowly turned toward me. I was so terrified that I immediately covered myself with a thin, soft blanket over my head, not daring even to breathe. I waited for it to catch me. to take me into the dark until fear and exhaustion forced me back to sleep. The image in the information jumped abruptly, but kept the same geography. The furniture in the house was different, more modern, but the layout remained the same. 40 years later, when I was 48, I returned to that same house for a vacation. My parents lived there now. They slept in the room where I had slept 4 decades prior, and I slept in the living room where my grandparents once lay. A little before 3 in the morning, the dogs began to bark frantically outside. The moonlight was so strong, it looked like dawn. I dressed, went out, petted them, and concluded it was likely a passing deer. When I returned inside, I stood by the dining table to undress for bed, and at that moment, something happened that froze my consciousness. The Sylvaeron crew saw the scene from both sides simultaneously in the information. I caught myself. I realized I was standing by the dining table, one hand resting on the chair, the other on the table. Chills ran through my entire body. I turned my head toward the bedroom and saw myself in the past, that small, terrified 8-year-old boy looking at me with wide eyes, then covering himself with that same thin, soft blanket in mortal fear. I smiled gently at that child. I was that creature. Without conscious intent, my spark, in that same instant, opened a higher etheric portal between times from both sides. I should have sent him a message, told him everything would be all right, but before I uttered a word, in the information, the portal closed. Lemira, Eleran, Siltha, Thera, and Ernos remained frozen. Their thoughts were overwhelmed with wonder. They had read about time distortions, but Alexander described an organic opening of a portal that connected 2 material points in time through the pure, emotional, and informational resonance of the spark. They were confused by Alexander's statement, a stone dweller unconsciously bending time in a way they could not, even with the most advanced scalar generators. From where does this power come? Thera wondered in the mental link, while Ernos tried to map the energetic footprint of that portal, but found only pure, unformed, white light. In the astral space Alexander projected, the milky white light abruptly gave way to dense, sticky shadows. The atmosphere became heavy, filled with a frequency that tore at the Sylvaerons' subtle senses. It was the scent of fear and old smoke, the scent of entities that had stifled sparks on Earth for millennia. While I lived in the city with my family, my wife and son, Alexander continued, and the images of the urban landscape began to warp under the influence of dark forces. At indefinite intervals, I experienced attacks from entities you call the Umbran Noxa. They waited for the moment of my greatest material weakness, sleep. The first 2 times they found me in our home in the city, 2 years apart. 4 years after the second attack, 2 consecutive attacks followed out of nowhere during the night, while I was on vacation at the sea with my family. The Sylvaerons saw the scene. Alexander lying in bed, his wife and son sleeping beside him, the sea murmuring in the distance, but something not of matter materializing in the room. All 4 times the attacks were successful in their material approach. Alexander described, his voice cold and precise. They always caught me while I was sleeping on my left side. In my subconscious, I would suddenly wake up. I would feel a terrifying weight on the side of the bed, right behind my back. I would hear and feel the mattress sink, simulating a person sitting down, and then that being would lie down behind me, pressing its cold, non-material essence against my back. Their hands were not hands. I felt them as long, sharp claws that passed through the physical part of the bed like fog. Those claws would firmly, unshakably grab me by both arms, while the lower claws wrapped tightly around my legs, paralyzing me in my own vehicle. The first 2 times, while I lived in the city, I fought with every atom of my strength. It was a painful, unpleasant experience because their dissonance burned my spark. They would enter me through the entire surface of my physical body, and then there would be only darkness in my head. I would fall asleep, exhausted and possessed. The image changed. The sea again, the smell of salt and night heat. Alexander's face in sleep was calm, but the spark in his chest pulsed brilliantly. When the 3rd and 4th attacks occurred while on vacation at the sea, I met them consciously. Alexander transmitted, and the Sylvaerons saw 2 Umbra-Noxa entities, one after another, penetrate his body. I let them in without a fight to do what their purpose was, but now I was hunting them the moment those parasites entered my material vehicle. My consciousness recognized them as a foreign body, like a virus in a perfect system. With my consciousness and my spark in a fraction of information, I would instantly disintegrate the sparks of the Umbra-Noxa entities as a foreign body, without any remaining information that they ever existed. It was total elimination. I realized this was the mechanism they used over the entire human civilization, entering people, possessing them, and shaping their thoughts and emotions. But in me, they encountered a defense system they could not even overcome. Lamira, Eleran, Zilta, Daera, and Ernos processed this information individually. Each was in a state of profound wonder. They realized that before them was not a victim, but someone who possessed knowledge, strength, and a will that exceeded even the defensive protocols of their higher etheric suits and star dancers. Where does this knowledge come from? Zilta wondered, feeling deep awe. Did someone or something give him all this knowledge? While the words about the Umbra-Noxa entities echoed in the astral projection, eldest elder Lyra'el staying connected to the group, felt something that forced her scalar consciousness into a total expansion in the higher etheric energy around the information bubble they were in. Entities began to arrive through Lyra'el's eyes from even higher etheric energies, entities of such grandiosity and abstractness arrived that their every movement changed the color of the ether around them. They were unformed, transparent, yet present like mountains of light. They did not transmit information. They did not send signals. They were simply there. The well-known Lyra'el D'ahn also appeared, the quiet teachers of the Sylvaerons, but compared to these new arrivals, they looked like faint echoes. These higher entities arrived in vast informations. It was impossible to count them, for in those spheres, number does not exist, only intensity. They mastered frequencies that were so subtle that no one in the solar system, nor any black probe, could detect them. They silently observed the material cosmos and the suffering earth. Lamira wondered, filled with sorrow, will all these powerful witnesses, these emerald and white observers, just silently watch the ruin of a civilization? The silence of the higher entities was absolute and terrifying. Eleran, sensing Alexander's human grief, asked mentally, "Where is your material family now, Alexander? Why are you alone in this cabin?" Alexander's response was propped by a resonance that sounded like cracked crystal. "I parted with my wife Una and son Vanya years ago. Material proximity became impossible for us. When my son and I are next to each other, our auras create such interference that they reveal our true imprint and information to every scanner in the system. I had to separate from them to save them. Vanya and I are, in essence, the same in the higher etheric energies. Vanya, just like me, told my wife and me in his 3rd year that he really wanted to be born with us, and then, by the law of matter, he forgot. Before we physically parted, I implanted information in him. I knew that when he turned 13, he would experience the same breakthrough before the mirror that I did. He is the same essence as I." An image of Una appeared in the astral space, a beautiful woman with a blue aura, the color of goodness, and a pure earthly spark. "My wife Una," Alexander continued with deep love, "she is a natural spark, one of the billions who are trapped in the system and who return every new cycle from that artificial incubator on the moon. I could never reveal to her who I really am, for that truth would scorch her fragile structure. But today is a special day. In a few hours, Vanya will turn 13. He will experience awakening. In that moment, our frequency will become complete. We will be ready for what is to come." The Sylvaerons observed Alexander, realizing that this man carried a burden of isolation that none of them could endure. he had waited for decades, in the silence of the mountain while his loved ones lived in oblivion, only to preserve the sparks that would eventually enlighten the universe. In the astral projection, Alexander's voice became ancient, resonating like the deep tones of a planetary core. Images began to materialize around the Sylvaerons images they had previously known only from the most guarded etheric books. But this time, they were vivid, painful, and hyper-detailed. "You remember the records?" Alexander began, and the space transformed into the sky of Sylvaeron on fire. "You remember the arrival of what you called the Void. You did not see them as beings, but as an endless ocean of insatiable, amorphous shadows imbued with sinister red energy. They were driven solely by a primal hunger for the life spark, something they themselves did not possess, and which they had to devour to feed their own nothingness." The crew watched a terrifying sight in the information. The voids managed to break through the crystalline gates of your planet, creating what your history calls the Vel's cracks. Through those wounds in the fabric of reality, red swarms poured onto Sylvaeron, sucking in thousands of your ancestors' sparks. Every Sylvaeron who fell then did not die their spark, was sucked into the dark vortex, losing identity in an eternal scream. "You fought back then," Alexander continued, as images of their ancestors outsmarting the voids flashed before them, making the shadows believe the entire civilization was fleeing into the higher etheric energy. But the battle only moved to a higher level. You believed in victory, while you, your material allies, the travelers, an ancient race of etheric nomads whom the Sylvaerons once helped, and the allied higher etheric entities, the Guardians, fought to exhaustion. But the voids were unstoppable. They looked like swarms of starving insects enjoying the very process of destruction, the stifling of light. They fed on your fear, distorting even the purest vibrations to their advantage, turning your hope into their own dark essence. The light of your allies was fading. Sylvaeron was on the verge of total extinction. At that moment, eldest elder Lyra'el was experiencing in the information what she had only read about. She saw how, on the edge of that ancient struggle, entities from even higher etheric energies gathered, radiant, unformed shapes of emerald and amethyst. The observers moved in superluminal informations through the chaos, never interfering, impersonal and eternal. But then, Alexander's voice became triumphant. From the very heart of the distortion, the great white higher etheric power emerged. It had no shape, no defined size that could be grasped by your senses. It was pure will, unimaginable in its power. Its energy was so absolute that it represented the very essence of resolution, a silent response to the cries of all beings of light. It shone with non-material light that overwhelmed every other vibration. The Sylvaerons felt that power pulse in the information. Scalar strings straightened under its touch. Chaos retreated, and the devastated battlefield transformed into a serene symphony. In an instant, that power devoured and destroyed all entities of the void. Not even an echo of their evil remained, nor a shadow, only absolute nothingness where they once rampaged. You were a threat to the Sylvaeron, and they sent the void after you, but they attacked the wrong civilization, Alexander said. The Sylvaeron then retreated to this remote place, Earth, to spread their empire from here like a virus and build a trap for the source. They planned to infiltrate the source itself by hiding their evil sparks within ordinary human sparks upon their return. However, the great white higher etheric power absorbed all information through the cosmic network of the higher etheric entity water, through the water in the bodies of every being. The white power knew every move of evil. A silence followed in the astral space that lasted several informations. Eleron, Siltha, Thera, and Ernos slowly turned their mental gazes toward Alexander. Their sparks began to resonate with his white aura in a way that was impossible for any material being. The realization did not come as a thought, but as an enlightenment that scorched away all their previous delusions. "It is you," Eleron cried out mentally, the cry echoing through all the dimensions they occupied. "You are that supreme entity. You are the one who saved our civilization from destruction. You are the source itself, standing before us in this human vehicle." Alexander looked at them, and his smile was not just human. It was a smile that contained the birth and death of billions of galaxies. "I am not one," he replied in a gentle mental voice. "I am everything. Within me lies the information of all sparks that ever set out on the path of material experience. I, along with Vanya and the other entities in physical form who have long been on planet Earth, were scouts. We are the medium of all sparks that exist, witnesses who descended into the deepest darkness to understand it before transforming it." The crew and Lemira were overwhelmed with an excitement that was indescribable. They felt like drops of water that had finally recognized the ocean from which they sprang. The fear of the mission vanished, replaced by absolute trust in the being who had summoned them. The realization that the Supreme Entity himself had chosen them to be witnesses to this final act made their suits flicker in the purest turquoise tones. Alexander looked at them again, and then his words became commanding, yet still warm. "Now we return to wakefulness. Do not make any sudden movements should any unforeseen situations arise. Our conscious presence in matter must now be flawless." The astral projection slowly dissolved like mist before sunrise. One by one, the Sylvaerons woke up in their animal bodies in the cabin, Alexander was already on his feet. He calmly headed to the old stove, lighting it with beech wood that immediately began to crackle, spreading warmth and the scent of a mountain home. He put on water for tea from meadow plants, that morning ritual he performed every day. As always, he carefully placed food for the dog and cats in pottery bowls and then poured them fresh, clean water. The Sylvaeron crew and eldest elder Lyra'el just watched him silently. Before them sat the exalted being in the body of an ordinary older man, performing the simplest material tasks. They watched him, feeling an awe so thick it could be felt in the air. God was feeding his companions and preparing tea, while something sinister was brewing outside the walls of the cabin. At that moment, the morning silence was broken by a sound that accelerated the pulsing of their sparks. Someone knocked on the door. The sound of knocking on the wooden door of the cabin echoed through the room like thunder in the 0 second. The crew instantly felt the presence of 2 human beings, but what their internal sensors registered was incomprehensible to any science they had studied on Sylvaeron. Alexander straightened up, and the air around him began to vibrate at a frequency that tore the veil of matter. His body began to radiate a brilliant white aura, and the spark in his chest flared with the color of absolute whiteness, a color that Lyra'el, El'aran, and the others had never seen in a single physical body, even in the highest etheric spheres. When Alexander opened the door, his wife Una and son Vanya stood before him. In the information, Una radiated a warm, calm blue color, the color of a good and pure human soul, unaware of the cosmic storm brewing. But Vanya, the boy, stood beside her like a pillar of white light. He was part of Alexander, his perfect extension, illuminated by an identical aura and a flashing spark. The enlightenment the boy had experienced before the mirror just a few hours ago was complete. He was now a navigator in the body of a child. The 3 of them embraced, creating a vortex of light that momentarily illuminated every dark corner of the cabin. The Sylvaerons watched this scene in silent admiration. "Happy 13th birthday, Vanya," Alexander said, his words carrying a code that permeated the entire house. From his pocket, he took out a gift, a beautiful hourglass made of transparent glass and dark wood. Vanya looked his father in the eyes, and Alexander just nodded slightly. Both smiled with a silent code of absolute understanding. Vanya took his gift and went toward the living room, where he stopped for a moment in front of the shelf with old family photographs. He carefully turned the hourglass over and placed it on the shelf. Tiny grains of sand, which in the information looked like compressed parts of time, began to slowly trickle down into the now empty glass section. The crew and the Myra watched the scene, realizing that Alexander and Vanya were now complete, joined in the same frequency. They were ready, and the sand in the hourglass marked the countdown to something unimaginably large. Lyra'el sensed in the scaler how Vanya mentally recognized the crew. The boy looked at them, smiled, and mentally sent a thought that touched them to the core. Wonderful Sylvaerons. While Una, filled with warmth and love, approached and petted Ziltha and the kittens, Alexander and Vanya easily prepared tea for the three of them. Una was delighted by what she saw. Alexander, how did you manage to gather a dog, a cat, and this many little kittens in the same room and have such peace prevail? She embraced and kissed him again, then joked, unaware of the weight of the moment. Do I see sparks of long-forgotten love in your eyes? Or are you drinking some silly water? Everyone laughed out loud. Even the Sylvaerons in the bodies of animals began to bark and meow, participating in the joy, but the laughter slowly faded as they realized that those sounds, emitted in such a rhythm, did not sound natural at all. A silence ensued. Una continued, I missed you so much. I still don't understand why we had to be apart for so long. Ah, yes. You and your mountain, while I prefer the city bustle. Alexander just nodded slightly, letting her believe in that simple material reason. Alexander took his tea, sat in the armchair by the fireplace, and took his wooden staff in his left hand. In the same fraction of information, eldest elder Lyra'el, hovering above them in the scalar wave frequency, activated the information she had sent from the past. The wooden staff in Alexander's hand shook violently. Vanya, Eleran, Ziltha, Thera, and Ernos clearly saw the distortions of space and time spreading around the staff in Alexander's hand. Alexander slowly took a sip of tea, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. You know they are coming, Alexander told his son mentally. I know, Father. We are ready, the 13-year-old Vanya replied. Who is coming? Eleran asked mentally, feeling the discomfort from the meadow intensify 1,000 times. The phantoms are coming, Alexander replied. Beings that mimic black-clad humans, but their essence is parasitic. They are Jel'thos Morphe, into whose minds the Umbra Noxa have infiltrated. This is the very top of their special units. The evil entities sensed your presence. They felt the shudder and discomfort you emitted on the meadow. That race is too familiar to them, and they want your sparks. Before the crew's eyes, Alexander projected the moment they first stepped onto the terrace and unconsciously activated the stone sensors and the black probes. In the same instant, Alexander and Vanya spoke mentally, in the same vocal rhythm, in two voices at once, in a tone that permeated the walls of the cabin. Eleron, Zilpha, Phaera, and Ernos stay absolutely still in this frequency and do not move from the room. Lemira, exit the scalar wave frequency and shine as brightly as you can with all your energy through your higher etheric suit. Show yourself to all the higher etheric entities. A loud, arrogant pounding on the door interrupted their communication. Una was terrified. She looked out the window and shrieked in horror. The entire yard was filled with black SUVs with police lights, and the cabin was surrounded by men in black. It looked as if darkness had fallen on the mountain in the middle of a clear day. "Alexander, what is this? What do they want from us?" Una screamed. While slowly rising and moving toward the door, Alexander said in a calm voice, "Everything is fine, Una. They are likely looking for someone, and we are the only house here. They will leave as quickly as they came." Simultaneously, he mentally ordered the crew and Vanya to be with her and calm her. The crew held a mental monologue, ready to switch into higher etheric combat suits and die for Alexander. But Vanya's spark, which momentarily turned dark gray for mimicry, stopped them. "Do not doubt the words you have heard." In the higher etheric energy, Lemira discarded her scalar cloak and revealed herself in her full aquamarine turquoise glow. The evil races lurking in the ether, hunters and traders, saw her as easy prey. But the moment they prepared to attack, Lemira flashed with the full power of her suit. In the same information, all the higher entities that had been hidden until then removed their frequencies. The pack of predators experienced a fraction of information of unimaginable fear before their bodies and sparks were disintegrated into nothingness. Lemira became the messenger. She set the entire higher etheric energy in motion. Alexander opened the door. 3 agents in black suits stood before him. Lead Agent Brutos took off his glasses, giving him a wicked, ironic smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Alexander. Since we don't have much time, I'll be direct. Do you have anything to report? Are you hiding any special people in your dilapidated wooden little house?" Alexander read their minds like an open book. They planned to eliminate him and his family and kidnap the Sylvaerons to hand them over to the Zilar-Khael entities as trophies with which they would later attack Sylvaeron. The agents enjoyed their supremacy, predatorily observing their victims like helpless lambs. "Dear gentlemen," Alexander said calmly, his voice deepening, "once upon a time, there was room for everyone in my little cabin, but now there is no more room for you." The phantoms began to laugh loudly, but then something happened that no one had ever seen. Alexander did not use a mental attack. He manipulated the very element of life. Since every living organism, even the reptilian Gelthus morphi, contains water, Alexander began to change its frequency. The water in every cell of the phantoms became a coded instrument. Their bodies began to vibrate, at such speed that the Umbra Noxa parasites were instantly ejected from their brains and bodies, unable to withstand the vibration of the water. The Sylvaerons watched as the reptiles lost the ability to change shape. Their bodies warped, emptied, and helpless. Alexander toyed with them like prey, while his spark returned to a brilliant white color. "I would have someone to report," Alexander tossed at them mentally. "But you and your bosses, the Sylar Kale, currently have much bigger problems than who is in my cabin." Defeated, stripped, and in mortal fear, the agents of darkness began to flee frantically through the forest. Alexander and Vanya were already receiving information. The Sylar Kale were withdrawing all their subjects. They knew what was happening in the higher etheric energy and were preparing for escape. The crew watched in the silence of the room what Alexander had done. They realized that the Source himself does not have to fight. He simply changes the laws of matter as he wishes. The danger from the phantoms had passed, but in the information they knew what was coming next, nobody on the planet would be able to escape. The silence that followed the flight of the phantoms was unnatural, dense, and electric. Alexander returned to the cabin, and his face no longer betrayed any human emotion. It was an expression of absolute focus. Vanya stood next to the hourglass, watching the last third of the sand trickle irretrievably toward the bottom. "It has begun," Alexander said. His words were not meant only for those present, but echoed through the information field of the entire planet. At that moment, the Sylvaerons saw, through Alexander's projection, the horror unfolding thousands of miles away. The Sylar Kale, realizing they were losing control over the Source and that the higher entities had pierced the veil, activated their last protocol, the Dead Hand. It was not just a military system. It was a frequency of despair that forced human puppets in key positions to launch the mechanism of total destruction. The Sylvaerons saw in the information how silos across the east and west opened. Fire billowed from the bowels of the earth. Nuclear and hydrogen missiles, those iron carriers of nothingness, tore through the sky in perfect, lethal parabolas. Human civilization, in its final act of blindness, decided to burn its own cradle. In the higher etheric energy, Lemira tried the impossible. With her aquamarine turquoise being, she tried to summon the help of the higher entities, to stop the missiles, to freeze time. But the ether was in a terrible distortion. The energy released by the Sylar Kale was so dirty and dense that it stifled every subtle intervention. Lemira felt the shock wave of etheric filth hit her. Her suit flickered, losing stability. Abruptly, Lemira began to fall through the layers of the higher etheric energy. In the cabin, before the eyes of the terrified Una and the stunned crew, the air tore open with a loud crack of light and the scent of ozone. Lemira materialized in her true form as a magnificent being of pure light and energy in her higher etheric suit, kneeling on the cabin floor, exhausted. In the same instant, under the influence of Alexander's proximity and the collapse of matter, the other crew members also began to lose their animal forms. The dog and cats vanished in vortexes of turquoise energy, and in their places appeared Elloren, Ziltha, Theura, and Ernos in their true Sylvaeron forms. Una shrieked, retreating toward the wall, her eyes widening at the incomprehensible sight. "Alexander, what is this? What are these beings?" "These are our friends, Una," Alexander said, approaching her slowly. "This is the truth I kept in silence. Do not be afraid. They are here to escort us home." The sky outside turned orange-black. The sound of sirens in the distance mixed with the muffled rumble of the first explosions shaking the very foundations of the mountain. Armageddon was not tomorrow, it was now. "It is time," Vanya said, pointing to the hourglass in which only a few grains remained. Alexander took Una's hand. His touch was so filled with peace that her fear instantly evaporated, replaced by an inexplicable tranquility. He looked at the Sylvaerons, who stood in a circle, glowing in their original colors. "Let's go out to the meadow," he commanded softly. They left the cabin for the last time. The mountain trembled, and the air became hot. On the horizon, the sun was no longer the only source of light flashes. Of multiple nuclear strikes created new false stars that devoured the cities in the valley. They stood 20 paces from the cabin, on the very meadow where the Sylvaerons first stood while dreaming of the cabin. But now there was no discomfort. Alexander stood in the center, with Una on one side and Vanya on the other. The Sylvaeron crew formed a circle around them, holding hands, or what in their energetic form represented touch. "Look at your hands," Alexander said to Una and the Sylvaerons. "Look at these bodies. They were wonderful vehicles, temples in which we experienced the scent of pines, the coldness of water, and the pain of love. Thank them. But we are not flesh. We are not bones. We are the spark that knows no death." Above them, the clouds parted, revealing the golden sun, which at that moment was in perfect alignment with the center of the galaxy. Alexander's and Vanya's auras began to expand, devouring everything within a few meters. Their white light became so intense that the nuclear flashes on the horizon looked like pale candles beside it. All 8, Alexander, Una, Vanya, and the 5 Sylvaerons, merged into a single unique embrace. There were no more boundaries between the human mother, the 5 Sylvaerons, and the source itself, the 13-year-old boy, Vanya and Alexander. There was only one frequency, the frequency of return. In that moment, the last grain of sand in Vanya's clock fell. The world turned into absolute, piercing whiteness in a second. There was no sound of explosion. There was no pain. It was a flash that scorched the darkness of the entire solar system. Every spark on planet Earth felt that moment as a sudden awakening from a nightmare. No one was left on the meadow. Only the empty cabin and the hourglass remained, which, turned upside down by the force of the energy, began to count down some new, different time. After the flash that consumed the material reality of the meadow, a silence followed such as even the oldest Sylvaerons could not imagine. It was not the absence of sound, but the presence of absolute peace. The sparks of the five companions, Lemira, Elloran, Siltha, Thera, and Ernos, hovered in the boundless space of the higher etheric energy, but this time without protective suits and without fear of dissonances. "You are among your own," the information echoed, carrying the frequency of the very center of existence. The Sylvaerons felt the presence of Alexander and Vanya at that moment, but they were no longer father and son in human bodies. Before them stood the great white higher etheric power, the supreme entity in its full, unformed glory. Around them, the grandiose figures that the Sylvaerons had worshipped and learned from for millennia materialized the Lyra'el D'ahn entities. But then something happened that was not written in any etheric book. All five Sylvaeron sparks felt a sudden expansion. Their sparks, which until then were limited by body consciousness, began to branch out and absorb frequencies that were previously reserved only for their Lyra'el D'ahn teachers. In a single information, they experienced enlightenment. Death on planet Earth was not the end, but a supreme initiation. They realized that absolutely all entities located in the higher etheric energy can also return to the source as sparks in every information, thus closing the circle of experience and existence. They learned the truth that the Lyra'el D'ahn had kept from them, so that the experience of matter would be authentic. Every Sylvaeron who completes their material cycle in harmony becomes a Lyra'el D'ahn themselves. Lemira, Elloran, Ziltha, Thera, and Ernos were transformed. They became abstract forms of pure, intelligent light and information. They no longer perceived the universe as a single flower. They now stood at the summit of the entire high tree. They could perceive the entire weaving of information non-linearly, being simultaneously present in all layers of what the material shadow called time, without effort. Frequencies were unlocked for them that had been inconceivable as physical beings. They felt the freedom of being in any magnitude or form, in any corner of the multiverse. It was surreally exalted, yet the most natural state they had ever experienced. From that exalted place, the five new entities observed the final act of justice. The supreme entity emitted the command information: return the sparks to the source, disintegrate the dissonant, sterilize the contamination, and manifest a new home. From the perspective of the material shadow, the sight was terrifying and magnificent simultaneously. Time and space began to compress at an inconceivable velocity. The moon, that artificial incubator of pain, materially disintegrated under the pressure of the white power. Billions of suffering and trapped sparks poured out of its core, liberated from the shackles of artificial reincarnation. Supreme entities of white and yellow light moved through the galaxies like relentless purifiers. They devoured all corrupted entities, Umbran Noxa, Nyalar Kael, and their subjects. The source was aware of the ambush. It knew that parasites had attempted to hide within the sparks themselves. The higher entities extracted every particle of darkness, erasing the Xylar Kael sparks as if they had never existed. In this process of total purification, the sparks of once powerful humans who consciously served the Xylar Kael forces, intentionally returning to Earth in cycles for power and destruction, were also irretrievably unmade by the supreme entities. Not a single echo of their dissonance was allowed to survive. That fragment of the purified universe continued to compress until it became a single, white-hot point of information. Within the higher etheric energy, the supreme entities established an impenetrable barrier, permanently separating the new order from the contaminated space. And then, in a fragment of information, a flash occurred. A powerful release of matter and energy began to expand space and time around itself. A new, young universe was born pure, devoid of parasites and predators. Within it, through eons, new galaxies and stars would be born, intended for sparks seeking to experience matter in its most pristine form. The 5 new Lyra'el D'ahn entities observed this potent yet beautiful birth. Within information, they grasped the essence. Sparks choose oblivion at birth, so that love, joy, passion, and hope in the material shadow may be real. Sparks themselves choose where they will be born, even their material parents. For the thirst for experience is absolute, but the source does not forgive those who corrupt the game. That is why the network of water was manifested to monitor every pulse of consciousness and signal when the universal balance is disturbed. After absorbing all the knowledge of the universe, the 5 new enlighteners appeared in the higher etheric energy above the well-known landscape. Below them lay Sylvaeron, bathed in the light of the golden and silver suns. They were once again in the clearing where they had last touched the grass with their physical feet, but now they hovered as pillars of translucent, graceful light. Through the weaving of information, they held a view of the cabin in that layer of existence which preserved the memory of the material shadow. They saw the smiling Alexander, Vanya, and Una. They felt a resonance of presence, knowing that they were now essentially one with them. They manifested beside the Academy of Light Flows and emerged from hidden frequencies. Instantly, a multitude of Sylvaerons gathered around them, young students, experienced navigators, and elders. Everyone was breathless, enchanted by the abstract beauty and authority radiated by these new Lyra'el D'ahn entities. The Sylvaerons recognized the frequencies of their teachers, but perceived that the Lyra'el D'ahn now possessed a far more exalted resonance. The 5 new entities addressed what was once their kind with a collective information, directly transmitting visions of the journey, the horrors of Earth, and the magnificence of the Source. Their communication was not a vibration of air, but a direct infusion of consciousness. We shall enrich you with new knowledge toward enlightenment and progress. From this day forth, your light shall be a shield that no shadow will ever be able to pierce again. Sylvaeron pulsed in the rhythm of this new truth, while the song of the crystalline forest grew louder than ever before. In the infinite expanse, where matter and ether intertwine, truth is never hidden. It is merely invisible to those who have chosen the darkness of the shadow. The entire material cosmos, with all its galaxies and stars, is but a small meadow of grass and fleeting flowers at the base of the high tree. Many races spend aeons desperately clinging to a single blade of grass, blinded by greed, failing to see the magnificent forest of higher etheric energy right in front of them. Most races see only power within their material cages, while above them pulses the high tree, whose peak reaches the source itself. They fail to realize that every galaxy they see is but a single flower on the meadow, while in the higher realms, every leaf is an awakened consciousness, and every branch an entire dimension of existence. The material body is but a flicker of a shadow, a fragile shell dissolving in silence. Good and evil are not battles for territory, but a struggle for the resonance of one's own spark. Those who choose greed and low frequencies remain tethered to the dust of the meadow. Those who find the key to consciousness become the very path that leads through the canopy toward the light. The universe does not belong to those who attempt to possess it, but to those who have the courage to become part of its song. The forest of worlds has always been there, behind the veil of your illusions. Freedom is not a destination, but a frequency you have forgotten.
Rhînvod ze snívanë.
Matter is a dream.
Shúmi ze zborí-vash.
Vibration is the judgment.
Sírzora
The source is the only truth.